Welcome to another coronavirus question and answer session, and thank you for joining us today. Not any financial investment or professional advice, and nothing in the content of this webinar shall be deemed to constitute the provision of financial, investment or other professional advice in any way. Our aim today is to discuss the job retention scheme, the changes that we've seen with this and furlough over the last couple of weeks. We'll touch on the job retention scheme portal, and finally we'll focus on workforce planning as we start to think longer term. I'm Helen Easton, and I'm joined this week by three of Mentor specialists. We've got with us Nick Sorrett and Edwina Redhead for employment law, and Keith McIlroy for health and safety. At the moment, all participants are on listen only mode, and there is an option to ask questions as we go along via the Q&A button within the Zoom. We'll attempt to answer as many of your questions as we can during this session. Our answers, I would say, will be general, so we do ask that if you have got something very specific regarding your own business circumstances, that you contact us directly. Nick, I'm going to come to you first from an employment law basis, and let's talk about the job retention scheme. My first question is, what is the new cut-off date for individuals to be eligible?
Yes, Helen, thanks everybody for joining this audio. Yes, the new cut-off date now has been announced as the 19th of March, and that's extended from the 28th of February. But the key is that the employer must have started the employee on their payroll on or before the 19th of March and made a real-time information submission to HMRC on or before the 19th of March. So some employers are still slipping through the net, but it's the date you made the real-time information submission that's important.
Thanks for that. Something else that we're being asked is, can you now confirm how long the scheme has actually been extended for?
Yeah, it was previously due to run until the end of May. It's now been announced that it's running until the end of June, and they've also indicated that it may be extended. And we believe this is to try and offer some reassurance and prevent employers issuing redundancy notices and consultations that they might have to start doing soon if they haven't extended it to the 30th of June.
Okay, thanks. So, Edwina, from an employment law perspective, what are the written requirements now that we need to have for furloughing staff?
Yeah, thanks for that, Helen, and thank you everyone for joining. So there's definitely been some confusion in this area, partly because we have had guidance from the government, but also direction from the Treasury. But in essence, what employers need to do is they need to reach agreement with the individual that they are furloughing and have a written record of this, and the individual needs to be informed that they are not able to complete any work whilst furloughed. HMRC have said that records should be kept for a minimum of 5 years because they will retrospectively audit some employers. So really worth pointing out that written records should be kept on file for anyone that you're furloughing.
Okay, thanks for that. A couple of questions that we've had through today have been around what if the business receives some form of government funding, or if they work for the government specifically. Can they furlough staff, and specifically within that band, can they furlough staff who have received perhaps a shielding letter?
Yeah, Helen, there's been some confusion about this. The scheme's clearly set up for employers who aren't funded by the government, but where organisations do receive government funding, it's really anticipated that those staff could be redeployed to help with this sort of NHS effort against coronavirus, and it wouldn't be necessary to furlough those people. But there are clearly some staff now who have been told to stay at home and shield, so unless their work can be done from home, in which case obviously they should be paid for it, then those staff can be furloughed. And the government guidance indicates that the scheme may be appropriate for some staff if those staff cannot be redeployed to assist with the coronavirus response. So it seems to me that shielded staff in this position, it would be appropriate for employers to use the furlough scheme for them.
Okay, we've talked in previous webinars, and I'm being asked again today, I can see it coming up on the Q&A, about rotating staff through furlough. So actually, I want to ask two questions here. One is, are you able to rotate staff through furlough? And if so, how do you do it? And also, how would you recommend people go about choosing which staff to put on furlough?
Yes, Helen, in a word, yes, employers can rotate staff on furlough, but the condition to qualify for the furlough grant is that there needs to be a 3-week minimum length for each period of furlough. So if you're looking at your workforce, you may furlough some people for 3 weeks, and then those people could come off furlough, and you furlough others for 3 weeks. You can then re-furlough at any point the staff who've been on furlough, but at each point they must have a minimum of 3 weeks on furlough to qualify for the grant. What I would say is that as the scheme is due to come to an end at the moment on the 30th of June, employers do need to watch, if they're doing that they're not starting people on furlough close to the 30th of June, and then the scheme ends and the employee doesn't get their 21 days in. So that's one issue. Sorry, I missed the other question.
It was about how you would go about choosing which staff to furlough.
Well, this is, again, a really interesting one. There really isn't any guidance here. And the important point is that where staff are on furlough, they mustn't be doing any work for the employer. Now, I suppose at one level you can ask for volunteers, but you may not get the appropriate people volunteering. You need to look at the skills that you need to retain in your business. You also do have to be very careful that you don't discriminate when you furlough. And there's all sorts of learned discussions about discrimination, but there's 2 points of view here as to whether actually having people sitting at home being paid for doing nothing is favourable treatment or less favourable treatment in discrimination law. You know, there could well be arguments. So it's best to take some advice on that if you're considering it.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. I thought that would be an interesting answer. So look, if we've got a business where they have furloughed some staff this week and then they realise that they need to furlough some more staff next week, are they able to sort of go in and to the portal and make 2 different claims within for furlough?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So you are able to furlough individuals at different times, and indeed that is quite common. However, you can only make 1 claim per pay period. So if you are furloughing different individuals at different times, you will need to be mindful of this and obviously complete the individual calculations in working out what you need to submit to HMRC via the portal. So yes, you can furlough different people at different times, but only 1 claim can be submitted.
Thanks for that, Edwina. I'm going to ask a supplementary question around furlough again. If originally, especially this is about the written part of it as well, if originally when a business decided to furlough staff a few weeks ago, they furloughed on 100% pay, can they now change their minds and make it, you know, and say reduce that at all?
I'll take that one. Yeah, they can, but it's clearly going to involve a change to the contract of employment. Furlough scheme's quite clear that really all the furlough scheme is doing is reimbursing wages that would otherwise be due. So the employment relationship remains with the employer, and the employer will have to negotiate a pay cut with those workers. It probably won't be too difficult to do that, but they do need to do that, and they would then need to get separate written evidence that they've done that, you know, a separate agreement in writing to confirm that that's the case.
Okay, that's good advice. Thanks, Nick. So government guidance states that furlough can now be extended to those with caring responsibilities, childcare, you know, someone who's shielding. What if the business is still carrying on? There's still work for these employees to do, and potentially what if the business is a critical business, so a key business? Do they have to furlough? Can they furlough? What's the guidance?
Well, it's up to the employer whether they take advantage of the furlough scheme, which, as I say, is just a reimbursement of pay that would otherwise be due. But we do have these categories of worker who simply have been told that they cannot come into work because they're shielding, or because they have caring responsibilities with the schools being closed. And if work can't be arranged for them to be done at home, then, you know, in employment law, you have an interesting situation, because you have a situation where someone isn't really able to do the work that's available. So generally, we would advise, well, there's no need to pay the employee in that circumstance. Well, clearly the furlough scheme is available to make up the wages of those individuals very generously, and I think employers should take advantage of that to ensure these people do get their pay. But there is no law that says that they must do that.
Okay. Keith, are there any health and safety considerations in those circumstances?
Well, as Nick has said, you really shouldn't be working if on furlough. However, what I would encourage is the potential to maybe do some training by using maybe the e-learning modules or Mentor Live, and that would get people ready for when they return to work. There's good stuff in there around home working, pandemics, COVID-19, lots and lots of stuff in there. But really, I wouldn't recommend people going into work if they're on furlough. I don't know if that's going to cause issues around insurance, if they shouldn't be on the premises or they shouldn't be working, and then something happens, that may well cause an issue going forward.
Okay, thanks, Keith. Edwina, you know, Keith's just referred there about, you know, people not working when they're on furlough. So what are the rules and regulations? Can we ask anybody that's on furlough to come in and just do the odd day? Can we ask them to, if they offer to volunteer to come in and do some work? What you know, give us some guidance on that.
Sure, yeah, no, really good questions there. So the scheme is clear that to be eligible to receive the grant and the reimbursement, that the employee needs to cease all work. They cannot do any work for the employer that's either providing a service or generating revenue. So that's a really important point. So I think we've been asked questions around, you know, can a person work for a day, maybe to process payroll or something like that? And the answer is no, not in a period of furlough. But as Nick's already mentioned, there is the possibility to rotate furlough, or indeed an individual can finish a period of furlough, come back into the workforce to complete any work, and then be re-furloughed. That's absolutely okay to do that. In terms of volunteering, I think there's absolutely been some confusion in this area around, well, you know, if an employee volunteers to work, is that okay? Clearly, if the work that they're doing is providing services or generating revenue, that's going to fall foul of the furlough scheme. So that's not going to be allowed. I think where the volunteering comes into it is actually what the government wants to do is really encourage employers to you know, let employees volunteer elsewhere to support the coronavirus effort. So that is perfectly acceptable. That's fine to do, but actually volunteering internally while somebody is furloughed and the grant is being claimed, that's really not advisable to do that.
Okay, thanks. And Keith, any health and safety considerations for people working?
Well, if you're working from home, I'd stress that you need to ensure that all the work equipment is in place. Make sure that the staff member has all the required technology to carry out the work task. Do they have remote access to the work servers? I mean, failure to have everything in place will end up leading to stress levels increasing and well-being being impacted.
Okay. Keith, you mentioned about training earlier on, so I want to turn back to Edwina now and ask the question, because I've had a couple come through this morning to ask about training whilst on furlough. So Edwina, what are your thoughts and what guidance would you offer around staff completing training whilst they're actually furloughed?
Yeah, absolutely. So staff can complete training, again, provided that training isn't generating, you know, any revenue or providing services to the business. Staff can complete it, and actually it's a really good use of time to encourage staff to complete training during any period of furlough. So particularly if you have access to e-learning modules, for example, the ones Keith mentioned through Mentor Live, it's a really good use of the time to make sure that you are working on upskilling staff so that they are ready with the skills needed when the furlough period ends. So I would really recommend that people do take advantage and encourage staff to complete training wherever possible. Just a point to note that if the person who is being furloughed, if their furlough pay is below the national minimum wage, then you may need to top up their pay for any time spent training so that they are receiving at least the national minimum wage. So just a bit of a watch out there, but no, we would certainly advise that if it's a possibility for you, that you do encourage staff to complete training during this time.
I'd now like to move to talk about the actual job retention scheme portal that's gone live this week. Nick, it's a really basic question to start off with, but where do businesses go to access the portal?
Yes, Helen. Well, there's a link in the FAQs area of our Coronavirus Hub on Mentor Live, which you can click on. Alternatively, of course, you can just go to .gov.uk and enter the search term claim, and that was certainly one of the top results that was coming up earlier today. I would say that the portal seems to be working very well. As of close of business Wednesday, the Inland Revenue said that they'd processed 435,000 employers making claims in respect of 3.2 million employees, and they're paying out £3.75 billion. I mean, doing the maths, that's quite a large amount, £1,000 or so per employee, if my maths is right. And the portal does seem to be holding up really well. I haven't heard any bad stories about it.
So look, let's talk a bit more about the detail of claiming. What sort of information does a business need to list down to make that claim?
Yeah. You really need to get your ducks in a row before you go on to the portal. The portal is deceptively simple, and basically takes a broad brush approach of asking you for your HMRC details, but it asks for how much you're claiming as a gross amount and what period you're claiming for. So you do need to work that out ahead of making the claim. Now, there is an online calculator on the government website that helps you calculate wages for employees who have regular earnings. At the moment, they haven't added anything for employers who have variable earnings. So if you've got variable earnings, really you're going to have to go back to your payroll provider or look through your records to work out what earnings you're going to be claiming for. The important piece of advice really is to get your ducks in a row and do the calculation before you log into the portal. And bear in mind again, you can only make one claim per pay period, and your pay period may be monthly and maybe 4 weekly or whatever. So you mustn't forget any furloughed employees, because at the moment there is not the opportunity for you to go back and add further employees. Once you press the claim button, that's it, and you can only then make a claim for the next pay period next time.
Did I hear something about if you have more than 100 employees, you can upload a spreadsheet?
Yeah, you can, that's right. But if you have fewer than 100 employees, you do have to enter each employee's national insurance number. And that's really all you do have to enter. It does give you the opportunity to add some reference details, which would obviously help you maybe in seeing the salary reference numbers, but essentially you need to enter all their national insurance number details, unless you've got more than 100, in which case you can upload a spreadsheet.
Okay, so let's talk about the calculation question, which we get every single week without fail. Edwina, give us some guidance on how we calculate what furlough pay is actually due.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as Nick's already mentioned there, the starting point is understanding, does the individual have, you know, regular fixed pay, or actually does their pay vary? Because depending on that will decide which calculation you need to use. There is lots of guidance available online on this, so I would suggest that you know, employers do take advantage of that. HMRC have produced some webinars. Indeed, we have produced some worked calculations on the coronavirus section of Mentor Live. So what I would suggest people do is really take the time to look at those resources and then work through the calculations themselves. Obviously, if you use a payroll provider, or, you know, your company accountant, they may also be able to provide assistance as well. But really, really important that the information that, you know, you supply is accurate, so that you're not, you know, overclaiming. So certainly worth putting the time in to make sure that the calculations for, you know, each individual is correct.
Okay, and just, sorry, you may already have mentioned this and I might have missed it. We're claiming for basic pay only, commission, bonuses, what gets included?
Yeah, so it's basic pay, any regular payments that you are required to pay. So if you are regularly paying, you know, overtime, commission, that can be included. It is capped though to £2,500. So just something to be aware of, that cap is in place. You will need to cross-check what you're claiming to ensure it's not exceeding that monthly cap.
Okay, and then there's the sort of pensions question within that. So how much can we claim from a pensions contribution perspective?
I'll take that one. Yes, it is just the minimum auto enrolment pension contributions that you would pay. And again, there's a box on the portal to add employer's national insurance and the minimum pension contributions. But if you top up the pension, if you make an additional employer's contribution, that's not going to be reimbursed.
Okay, thanks for that. And the last one around the JLS portal that I wanted to ask is one that literally floods our Q&A inboxes: holidays. So 2 parts of this question. How should holidays be paid? And how do we treat bank holidays?
Yeah, so we have had confirmation that an employee can take holiday whilst on furlough. That's not going to break the period of furlough, but if the employee is receiving 80% of their pay, that will need to be topped up, so they're receiving 100% of their normal pay for any days that they're taking as holiday, and that would include bank holidays as well. So that will need to be topped up during that time if the employee is taking periods of holiday during furlough.
Okay, thanks. So look, we're getting loads of questions in now about what I would call forward planning and forward workforce planning. So I'd like to change our view now and think about when businesses start to come back into work, or you know, think about their futures. Edwina and Keith, really, what sorts of things should they be thinking of? So Edwina first, from an employment law perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, lots of businesses are starting to think about this. It feels like we're very much moving into you know, a new stage at the moment, where perhaps the chaos of a few weeks ago might have calmed down for some businesses, and actually really starting to think about what that new normal looks like. So really the starting point when it comes to workforce planning is thinking about what demands is the business likely going to face over the coming months. So really thinking about the next, you know, 3, 6 and 12 months. It's also a case of thinking about, you know, what are the current restrictions, because that may have an impact on, you know, your workforce planning. You may need more people at the time to ensure that, you know, you're able to adhere to all of the public health guidelines safely, or indeed, you know, you might need less. So really being aware of those restrictions, as well as your own internal resources and cash flow. Clearly that's going to factor into, you know, any workforce planning. We've seen a lot of businesses have pivoted in recent weeks. They're doing actually something that's maybe quite different to what they were doing at the start of the year. So thinking about what skills are needed, that's going to be a big part of any workforce planning. And of course, you know, things like anticipating holidays that will need to be taken, staff sickness, particularly if, you know, this is set to rise, which, you know, we think it may well do over the coming weeks. So all of these are really important considerations to make. What I would suggest is we've got some additional guidance on the coronavirus section of Mentor Live. So some really useful tools and templates to help businesses with their workforce and continuity planning. So definitely worth checking on there if this is an area that you're currently looking at.
Okay, and Keith, anything specific we need to think about from a health and safety perspective?
Yes, I would say that you need to carry out a return to work interview. You need to make sure that you notify your staff of the way work may have changed. For instance, it may reflect some social distancing guidelines. You may also need to use new PPE. We're waiting on an update, for instance, currently on face masks. And I'm getting asked the question an awful lot of why, you know, do we have to wear or don't we have to wear face masks? And I would say that currently we're still going by the World Health Organization, which is saying to us that there are only two groups of people who should wear protective masks. I've said this several times on these webinars, but it still is people who are sick or showing symptoms of the coronavirus, people who are caring for those who are suspected to have coronavirus. So people in healthcare. It says that medical staff, medical masks, should be reserved for healthcare workers. They need the most. Masks are not recommended for the general public at the moment because they can be contaminated by other people's coughs and sneezes, or when putting them on or removing them. A lot of people don't realise it's not as easy as just putting it over your ear. You need to make sure that it fits properly, and there's lots of stuff that needs to be communicated before we go down that route. I would also say that frequent hand washing and social distancing are still more effective. That's what we're being told, and that's the guidance we're taking. They also, they're saying that masks might offer a false sense of security. People might think, well, if now I've got a mask, I don't have to be 2 meters apart. I don't need to wash my hands, and that is not the case. You also, if any tasks have changed at work, then you might have to retrain. Keep a record of this, what training you've covered, when it happened, what you're covering, and when. Again, records are going to be key when we come out of this. Ensure that you keep a record of the changes to any risk assessments as well. Make use of the coronavirus section on Mentor Live. You will find many e-learning modules and forms that will help you stay on top of your duty of care for your staff at this time.
Okay, you mentioned social distancing in there, Keith, and I know we covered a lot about health and safety and social distancing in last week's webinar, but just to recap briefly for us, I've had a question through from a construction business where, you know, and there'll be other businesses that will also ask, you know, say for example those that are doing delivery or manufacture, where they can't maintain that 2-meter rule. What would your advice be to those types of businesses?
I would recommend that they go to the uk.gov website. There's a social distancing section on there which talks about all different industries, and that gives you the current thinking around guidance. Again, the sort of stuff that's been coming out of there which has been different is when people are going to work in maybe a van, of having 2 people sitting in the front of the vehicle. And they're saying, well, as long as we've cleaned it regularly, the people don't face each other, and that the windows are open, you know, that could be okay. So look at that. It's got lots of sector specialist stuff, and a little bit too long probably to go on this webinar at the moment.
Thanks, Keith. Nick, I want to turn to you now. We're talking about people coming back to work. What are the employment law considerations specifically that we need to consider?
Well, yeah, so it looks as if we're going to have an extended period where the lockdown is going to be released bit by bit. And so far, employees have proved to be very sort of versatile in adapting, but it does have employment law issues around it. I mean, with social distancing, where businesses decide that they can only let fewer people in their premises at one go, they may want to be opening their premises for longer hours. So you're looking there at changing people's hours of work, maybe looking at people commuting in to offices at off-peak times and leaving at off-peak times. So again, there's issues around hours of work. Now, those changes may need negotiating because people's hours of work may fit in with things like school time. So they can't just be imposed very, very readily. Also issues around asking people to work from home maybe in the longer term, because that's been quite successful, but employers may not yet have got to grips with issues around data security, IT issues, and even stuff like Keith's area, you know, the display screen assessment and so on. So it's really about looking at those longer term issues about whether you need to be changing terms and conditions of employment either permanently or temporarily, whether they're fit for purpose for the new normal. And so we're here to give advice on that, obviously, depending on the circumstances.
Okay, here's a question that has come up every single week, and I've literally just been asked it again on the Q&A stream. If we're asking our staff to come back to work and they refuse to, what on earth can we do?
Can I take that one? That's a really, really hot topic, and it's a sort of unintended consequence, I think, of the government's three-word message of stay home or stay at home, or whatever the three-word message is. And some employees are getting really concerned, particularly if they're on furlough, that well, why should I go back to work? I'm not sure that I'm safe to do so. Our advice is very much that you need to understand why the employee is refusing. At the end of the day, there isn't an entitlement to be on furlough, and the employer has to be careful that they're not claiming fraudulently through the furlough scheme if there's work for the employee to do, and they believe that they've created a safe working environment. Then on the face of it, that employee's failing to obey reasonable instruction. But the important thing is dialogue, because everyone is different, and people may have either misconceptions about the guidance. They may not be aware of the guidance that Keith referred to, you know, sector specific guidance. They may not be aware of the measures that have been put into place by the employer. They may have particular issues themselves with care responsibilities. Maybe they qualify for shielding, but we didn't realise that. So my key point there is to have a conversation, but ultimately the employer does need to take real care. I mean, we could go down and discuss whether it's appropriate to discipline. I think that probably wouldn't be appropriate, but I think that it should take real care and take advice after hearing what the employee's got to say.
Thanks for that. Keith, anything you want to add to that?
Yes. It's key, as Nick said, to communicate. You need to listen to your employees' concerns. Then you can point out what you have put in place to manage the issues raised. Hopefully that will make them a little bit calmer and a bit more likely to come back to work without any issues. They may not be aware of new work processes you've introduced or any additional available PPE you may have. Emphasise that they should let you know of any additional concerns they may encounter when they start back to work. They may raise points that you haven't yet considered, so it's an important line of keeping on top of everything. Ensure that they are fit to return to work by carrying out a health surveillance. Key that they are fit to be there, because you don't want them coming in and spreading any virus about, so that would affect more of your staff.
Okay, thanks. I've got a couple more questions that are coming in now. One, Edwina, I'm going to pose this one to you because I know we covered this on last week's webinar, but it's back to holiday again. We're going to have lots of staff who might be on furlough who are accruing holiday, and businesses owners are really quite frightened that when everybody comes back, you know, all their staff are going to want to take a year's worth of holiday in what is effectively 6 months. What advice would you give on this?
Yeah, so there's certainly a couple of things that businesses can consider. So the government have extended the working time regulations to allow holiday to be carried over. So that's the first point on that. Clearly, if people are requesting to take annual leave, then the normal process for, you know, requesting and accepting that would apply. So the employer is in control of how many people it's, you know, allows to be offered at any one time. So it really is up to the employer to manage that effectively, and that works the other way. If the if there are provisions within the contract to enforce holiday to be taken, then absolutely the employer can look to do that. So I think really the message is that whilst holiday can be carried over, the employer rather can still ensure that they're managing leave effectively, so that there aren't huge volumes left that the employer is then struggling to manage throughout the year. So I think taking a really proactive approach to this and making sure that it is managed effectively is really the way forward.
Thanks for that, Edwina. I want to look now at what we do when we go back into business, and maybe there isn't the work and you're thinking, businesses have planned and adapted and maybe they don't need as many staff as they've got. So Nick, if a business does need to let people go, is there a special process they need to follow?
Yeah, well, the furlough scheme was put in place to prevent mass redundancies and layoffs, and basically to sort of ride this storm out. Now, clearly, it may be that businesses do decide to have a different structure, or that they need fewer staff. And importantly, they still retain responsibility for those employees. So though the furlough scheme's been reimbursing their wages, effectively they're still on the employer's payroll, and the employer would have to consider redundancy or short-time working in the usual way. I mean, there are a variety of approaches that employers may want to look at, and there may be issues around, some sort of putting people on part-time working without having to make redundancies, and so on. But the important thing is, it's just as if the furlough scheme had never happened. You do need to look at your workforce planning, work out whether there are ways of avoiding letting people go. And if you have decided that that's the only option, you've got to follow a fair process and say we would be here to offer support and guidance if you make that decision. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I'm sorry, I was just scrolling through the questions again, because there was an additional one asked around that, as if you know at the end of the furlough period that there definitely isn't going to be any work, can you start the consultation period now?
Well, yes, you can, and this is where the sort of employment law and sort of public policy issues collide, because the government set up the furlough scheme to try and maintain people with a decent level of pay during the coronavirus crisis, and to reimburse employers for that, and to hopefully allow some restarting of the economy. But if an employer does decide, particularly with the overheads that they've got on top of that are not met by the job retention scheme, they really cannot continue, then the ball is in their court to make that decision. That there is no right for an employee to be furloughed. The employer can make that decision, but I would urge employers to, as they naturally would do, to consider all the alternatives and definitely to take advice on it. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. I think that was a really important question to answer, so thank you for doing that. We have skipped over the last few weeks, the amount of stress, anxiety, and general sort of well-being issues that have been caused by this whole situation. So I wanted to bring our last question to the panel around what can we do as employers and as individuals to look after staff well-being at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it certainly is one of the biggest issues that's facing employers, you know, and indeed individuals. I think really at the moment, all businesses do need to increase their efforts with staff well-being. Clearly, over the last few weeks, all businesses have gone through a period of change, whether that's, you know, staff being furloughed, whether that's staff working from home, whether that's, you know, a different way of working in your current premises. So there's been, you know, a huge period of change for, you know, pretty much everyone to undertake. We've talked about it in some of our previous webinars, but really thinking about communication is so important in supporting people's well-being. So actually, is the communication sufficient? Is it appropriate? Is the frequency of communication, is that right for staff? Really being mindful of your approach to communication is going to be so important in helping to support staff well-being at this time. We mentioned it, I think, on one of our previous webinars, but actually the NHS website, the Every Mind Matters section, is really, really useful, and certainly a tool that employers can guide employees to, as what they can do is answer a series of questions, and that will generate a personal wellbeing action plan with lots of steps that the individual can take to really improve on their well-being. So it's certainly worth looking at that, particularly if you know that people might be struggling at the moment, because it provides really practical guidance as to what people can do. I think also we've talked a little bit about workforce planning and business continuity. Business owners really do need to be mindful that when enacting any of these plans, thinking about how it's potentially going to affect people. So that should absolutely feature as part of any forward planning. Actually, how are these decisions going to impact on people in the workforce? Because it may well be that does have, you know, a direct effect on people's well-being. Thinking quite simply about how you check in with staff, even if staff are furloughed, you know, you still do need to remain in contact with them. And if staff are working from home, again, making sure that, you know, you have got appropriate methods to check in and make sure people are doing okay. And I think, you know, very simply as well, employers might just want to think about, can they be a bit more flexible at the moment? Actually, people are working very differently. You know, the schools are shut. People are having to in quite a lot of circumstances, juggle childcare and working from home. So actually, can the employer offer a bit more flexibility? Because that can certainly help to improve well-being. And then I think it's just the basics, really, by, you know, encouraging people to practice good self-care, so making sure they're getting enough sleep, they're getting breaks from, you know, technology, that they are, you know, looking after their, you know, their nutrition, they're getting that daily exercise in. All of those types of things we know will absolutely help to support people's well-being. There are lots and lots of resources on this in Mentor Live in the coronavirus section. So what I would suggest that any employers that, you know, are particularly looking at this and thinking about this, that they visit that section, because, as I said, lots of useful guidance, support, and indeed some offers as well that are in there. So yeah, definitely something to take advantage of. And I think what we will also be doing on our next webinar is talking in more detail about well-being. So yes, hopefully that will be one that we can obviously expand some of those points.
Thanks. And Keith, anything you want to add?
Edwina has covered almost everything for me, I think, but just to like to re-emphasize some of it, which communication is key. You need to make sure that there is two-way conversation going on, so people don't feel remote. So stay connected. Importantly, everyone should ask for help if it's needed. You know, don't sit there thinking, this is strange, I don't know what to do. That's only going to cause you stress. It's only going to affect your well-being. So ask for help if you need it. And that doesn't just mean the staff, that can be the directors, it can be the senior management team. If you need help, ask. We're here. and look at our FAQs. I know Edwina's mentioned our coronavirus web page on Mentor Live. It's excellent. It has got so many documents on there for you, and so many questions and answers as well. Remember, you can't fix a problem if you're not aware that one exists. So that's why it's so key to have this two-way communication. The last thing I would say is if staff are home working, create a routine. Make sure that you all take breakfast and lunch. Make sure that you do exercise. Plan the workload and the work hours. Just don't think, oh, I'll just turn on the computer and get on with it. You need to know what needs to be done that day, and you need to know what time frames you've got to complete them. Remember, structure will help with everyone's well-being going forward.
Thanks for that, Keith. We've come to the end of our time now, and we've attempted to cover as many of your questions as we could during this session. I'd like to summarise a couple of key points about the JRS portal. Please do prepare well before you go to it and submit your claims. Still as relevant today for every business as it was a month ago when we started these webinars. Plan what you're doing, adapt, and as Keith and Edwina have both said, communicate with your staff, really key. You can access loads more information, as everybody has said today, by logging into Mentor Live and checking on the special coronavirus area that we've mentioned so much. Make use of those regularly updated, frequently asked questions. Many of the questions that have been posed today will be used to update that particular area of the hub. Mentor Live also has the registration links to our next sessions, and as Edwina's already said, we'll be covering wellbeing next week, but we will continue to cover the furlough questions and the job retention scheme portal questions as well. For everybody registered on today's webinar, there will be a follow-up email with you shortly. It will have numerous useful links. Some of the pages that we've talked about today, the gov.uk, the NHS website as well will be on there. But there's also a way to get you onto Mentor Live as well by clicking on the coronavirus read more button. You can then use that to register for Mentor Live so you can have access to our specialist area. Look, if we haven't answered your question today, please do refer to our frequently asked questions, but also it may well be we haven't answered your question because it's very specific to your. So I would ask, please reach out to us and we will help you as best we possibly can. I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge, and most importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today.